Welcome to episode 3 of the ChickenBytes podcast series with Dr. Gustav Brink. In this episode, we uncover more on the rather contentious balancing act that is local poultry production versus poultry imports. Dr. Brink, can you expand further for listeners on the relationship between poultry producers and importers and why we find ourselves in this dynamic?
The whole chicken war, because you can't call it anything else, it's a very emotional thing. If you look at the rhetoric in the papers, in articles written by Sapa on the one hand and Amy on the other hand, clearly they would prefer never to set foot in the same room, whereas both of them could have added value to each other and could have assisted in improving things. Bear in mind that Amy stands for Association of Meat Importers and Exporters, so they actually represent domestic industry trying to export products to other countries as well, and they get linkages to other countries where we might send our product if it meets the international requirements, but we don't do that. On other meat products, not poultry, for instance beef, etc., we have recently concluded agreements with the Middle East, with the United Arab Emirates, with Saudi Arabia to export there, and there we do meet the requirements, which just shows that we can do it. On poultry, the first thing is we would have to cut down our brining to probably a maximum of 4%. I can't tell you exactly what the SPS requirements for poultry are in the EU. They would be high, but we have to look at that. If ever we want to export, and I mean, if you want to grow your industry, that's where you should go. Again, yesterday or the day before, there was an article from Astral saying what's happening and that they, for the first time in something like 20 years, actually have spare capacity because they can now produce, I think they said 6 million birds or process 6 million birds a month or something like that. I can't remember per week, per month, per year. But they're only producing at 5.5. But they can very quickly, within a month or so, scale up by the extra 500,000. Now, we've always had a shortage in capacity. So they've complained that, oh, we've got imports, but at the same time, they were not in a position to supply the market. And they said, but we have to stop the imports and then we'll increase production. But it means that when you then have to invest in new production capacity, etc., for a year or more, you would have a very big shortage in poultry. So you had to create the capacity. So Astral at least has done that now. But coming back to the rhetoric, one of the big things that the industry always says, and the publication Fair Trade, which honestly is anything about fair trade, what they're complaining about is the volume of poultry imported into the country. But then they include all products. And just about half of what is imported into South Africa is MDM, mechanically deboned meat, which we don't produce in South Africa, and which industry has specifically considered producing. They've done their cost studies and everything, and they've said it simply does not make financial sense to produce the product here because they can sell a carcass at a higher price than they can sell MDM. With MDM, you would take the carcass, you would then mechanically strip that meat, etc. So you still have to have an additional investment and everything. So industry, for very valid reasons, have decided not to produce the product. But every time they complain about the volume of imports, they include MDM into those volumes and then saying, oh, but imports constitute more than 20% of the total market. You can't do that with a product you have selected not to produce. So the moment you exclude that, imports, I mean, with the last anti-dumping investigation, the one against Brazil and the 4 EU countries, if you then do your calculations, the imports that they were complaining about constituted about 8% of the market for frozen bone imports. That's it, 8%. It's not so we have 80% or even 50% imports. We've got 8%. And you have this massive fight about that. That is a very low market penetration. Of course, one of the other big problems, and there I have a lot of sympathy with the domestic industry, is the anti-dumping duty-free quota we have for imports from the United States, which now stands at 71,000 and something tons. Now, bear in mind that when when that duty-free quota was granted, the EU was exporting around 122,000 tons of the product to South Africa. The moment that we gave that quota to the US, EU exports dropped to about 50,000. So the EU lost half of the exports because of this anti-dumping duty-free quota that we not just gave, but were forced to give to the US. You'll remember there was a lot of political pressure that if we did not give that to them, they would cut us out of the whole of the Africa Growth Opportunity Act, AGOA. So we didn't have a choice in doing that. The fact is, of course, that the quota is actually World Trade Organization, WTO, inconsistent, because the agreement says that anti-dumping duties must be applied equally to all countries or all sources found to be dumping. So we found the US to be dumping, rightly or wrongly. That's another debate. But that means that duty should apply to them. Now the US puts pressure on us and we give them an anti-dumping duty-free quota, which is, as I say, in violation of the WTO. So if the EU were to challenge our poultry measures in the WTO, this is one of the things they could challenge, and we would have to remove that, which could result in us being forced out of AGOA. So that's a whole political issue, which unfortunately in this case, the domestic poultry industry were the ones, were the victims in that political game. So there, I have a lot of sympathy with them because, as I say, I have my own opinion as to whether we could legitimately have imposed anti-dumping duties against the US, but it's for the US. They should have challenged us and said, well, there were problems. I mean, I was still working at ITAC at the time when we got letters from President Clinton's office complaining about the way in which we conducted the investigation and everything. If they really felt so strongly about it, why did they not take us to the WTO?
Yeah.
So clearly, because they were doing exactly the same thing in their investigation. So, so be that as it may, there are legitimate concerns from the domestic industry, especially as far as the US is concerned. We had in 2011 an anti-dumping investigation against Brazil, where there definitely was dumping. I mean, I was acting on behalf of one of the Brazilian exporters, and my client was dumping. There's no doubt about that. I would agree that they actually caused injury to the domestic industry. The problem was that ITAC fell over its feet in an attempt to prove dumping everything, that they cut corners.
Yeah.
And then once we imposed provisional duties, Brazil declared a dispute in the WTO, and Minister Rob Davies, as he was at the time, said, but I can't defend your investigation. And he, for the first time ever, rejected a recommendation by ITAC. Whereas in that case, duties should have been imposed. But because ITAC did not follow the rules, the industry did not get protection. And if we had protection against Brazil then, everything could have looked completely different.
Thank you for joining us today on Chicken Bites, and we hope to have you on the next episode.